All right. Chapter 15, Part 3. We're looking at Chapter 15 vocabulary terms, dealing with crisis and resurgence, essentially looking at the presidents from Nixon through Clinton. Let us begin. We're going to look at first the Department of Energy. We're looking at some of the events that happened during the Carter administration. So let's begin. The Department of Energy, created by Jimmy Carter. This was a law passed while Carter was president. The idea was to oversee the production and control of the nation's domestic energy. He increased oil in our strategic petroleum reserve. Sorry, I don't know why the word out is there. Okay, got rid of that. So let's go back and talk about this real quickly. Got to keep in mind that during the Carter administration, there had been an oil embargo and there was an energy crisis. The Middle East, OPEC, had stopped shipping this oil, cut back on the oil. They shipped this by a lot. And so we did not have the domestic capacity to make up for the lost oil coming in from OPEC. And so there were oil shortages, which meant a rise in the price of goods like gasoline and pretty much everything else. And so the Department of Energy was created to oversee the production of and the control of our domestic energy, which at that time was primarily oil. Now, since that time, we have diversified a little bit. We do a little bit with hydroelectric power, with solar power, wind power, nuclear power, on and on and on. But again, in 1977, no, we were not doing that. Now, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve is essentially oil that we store underground in some natural, I believe it's limestone caverns, where we have, I believe, millions and millions of barrels of oil stored that we can then pump out in the time of a crisis. And by and large, it is not a bad system. We have oil there. If we need it, we can pump some out. And when oil prices fall, we fill it back up. And we kind of go back and forth with that. Okay, let's move forward. 3 Mile Island. And 3 Mile Island was where a nuclear reactor was located. There was an accident in 1979. Now, of course, if you're a fan of Wolverine, you know that he and his brother in Deadpool did this. But again, if you're not a fan of Wolverine or the X-Men, you have no idea what I'm talking about. Well, yeah, you should watch a movie or read a book. But anyway, the nuclear reactor disaster at 3 Mile Island deeply affected Americans and our views of nuclear power. It allowed the government to highly regulate nuclear power. It, in this case, being nuclear power. Now, nuclear power is the cheapest, cleanest source of electricity there is in the world today. It is a great source of energy. However, there are some drawbacks. We have seen a number of incidents, 3 Mile Island. You have what happened in Russia. You had what happened in Japan a few years ago. You had the earthquake and the tsunami hitting Japan and nuclear power plant being affected by it. Again, technology has improved. And what has happened in Japan a few years ago, I believe that was a facility that was several years old. What happened definitely at 3 Mile Island. What happened in Russia. Again, these are all older plants where the technology was not up to date. If we really want to solve our energy problems, we would convert to nuclear power. Again, it is the cleanest. It is the cheapest source of energy. Of course, you do have the problem with the byproduct of spent nuclear rods, contaminated water that needs to be dealt with. But again, if you're looking for a cheap source of energy, nuclear power is it. And because of what happened at 3 Mile Island, the United States government, the American public began to fear nuclear power, and the government began to highly regulate it. There was a movie about the same time called the China Syndrome. The China Syndrome refers to a nuclear power plant melting down, a meltdown, and because of the superheated core, it would essentially melt through the floor, through the earth, all the way through to China, hence the concept of the China syndrome. When a nuclear power plant, nuclear power core melts down, it would essentially burn its way through the earth. Now, again, of course, it wouldn't do that completely, but again, that's what they called it. And so there was a movie about reporters inside a nuclear power plant. A guy takes it over, there's gunshots, a fear of a meltdown, blah, blah, blah. Created a lot of panic in the late 70s, early 80s. And of course, the Carter administration took advantage of that so they could regulate nuclear power. Okay, from this we have the birth of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, created by Carter to develop stricter standards for the peaceful use of nuclear power. Again, you can go back and look at this. I think the key here is the peaceful use of nuclear power, but I think that really is the key. Stricter standards created by the government. Now, should the government be regulating nuclear power? Yeah, probably to some extent, but you got to look at who's in office. Different presidents, different political parties have different views on energy, nuclear power versus wind versus solar, whatever the case may be. And the Democrats over the decades have been very, very reluctant to use nuclear power and to rely upon oil. They've attempted to diversify into, as things I said before, wind, solar, on and on and on, and the technology isn't there yet. So we're seeing problems. We have the Department of Energy being created. We have 3 Mile Island. We have the Nuclear Regulatory Commission being created to regulate nuclear energy in a period of time when the Department of Energy should be looking for any and all sources. I mean, again, we have the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. We are using nuclear power. Again, the Department of Energy, let me clean that up a little bit right there. The Department of Energy should have been looking for all avenues of new energy sources. Okay, I'm back. I got kicked off for a second there. Let me finish this one thought and move on to the last one on this page. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission, again, more difficult standards. The Department of Energy should be looking at all avenues for energy, oil-based, wind, solar, hydroelectric, and nuclear. Okay, let's go to our last one on this page, the Community Reinvestment Act 1977. This law, passed by the Democrat-controlled Congress, signed by Jimmy Carter, required banks, required I think is a key word here, required banks to make credit available in poor communities. The idea was to prevent the decay of low-income neighborhoods in inner cities. Again, we're talking places like Harlem and New York, Watson, Los Angeles. We've talked about those before. Unfortunately, and again, unfortunately, this practice brought about banking problems due to the fact that many of the people receiving the loans could not pay them back. So let's think about this for a second. So the Community Reinvestment Act 1977, good idea. We're going to require banks, the government is going to force banks to make credit available in poor communities. The idea is for that money to be used to ensure that low-income houses in low-income neighborhoods do not continue to decay, that they can be rebuilt, repainted, and if you got a problem with the plumbing, you fix it, you build new housing. Okay, good idea. The problem was that by forcing the banks to do this, okay, the problem that banks were being forced to do this, people who were receiving the loans couldn't pay them back. If you want to know what caused the housing market bubble to burst in 2008, it is this little puppy right here. This is the first step. The government forcing banks to make money available to loan money to people who can't afford to pay it back. This is just the first step. There will be additional steps that are taken during the Clinton administration, which we'll get to when we get there. But that was the first step toward the housing market bubble that burst in 2008. Okay, let's go to our next page, and we'll take a look at our first item here. The Panama Canal Treaty, 1977. Carter, still president. Carter, Jimmy Carter, the Democrat, signs over control of all of the canal zone to Panama, except for the canal itself. Okay, think about this for a second. We built the Panama Canal in the first decade of the 1900s. By 1977, it had been in our possession and our control for well over 60 years, 65 years, something like that. Okay? And so Jimmy Carter signed over control of all the canal zone to Panama, except for the canal itself. Now, Carter further agreed to turn over the canal by the end of the century. So, not only are we giving the canal zone over to Panama, now canal zone is this huge, wide, expansive thing. You have the canal itself, and then of course you have on either side, you have all kinds of things. You have docks and businesses and all kinds of stuff. And then he promised to give back, to turn over control, to give back the canal by the end of the century. And that was done a short time later. So the Panama Canal, which we built, our time, our money, our effort, our blood, Jimmy Carter gave away for nothing. And I've said numerous times that Jimmy Carter is one of the worst, I rate him number 2, worst president of all time. This is one of the reasons why. Now, well, you're going to say, well, Panama, don't care. We built it. It is essential for America, for our business interests and our national security interests. It's that simple. You don't give up a strategic asset like the canal unless you're a complete and utter bozo like Jimmy Carter. Next bullet. Israel, established in 1948. Now, the state of Israel was created at the end of World War II for the Jews to have a homeland. Okay? The states here, it was to be a homeland for the Jews. Again, this goes back to the Old Testament, the Exodus from Egypt, the splitting of the tribes, the 40 years in the wilderness, Moses, the Red Sea, blah, blah, blah. Okay. From that point forward, the Jews never had a homeland. They lived everywhere. I mean, they lived in Europe, they lived in America, they lived all over the world, but they did not have a home country. And so Israel was carved out of the Middle East. I mean, the only people who really lived there were some nomadic Palestinians, and it really was just an empty desert, really. Okay? So why did the United Nations create Israel? Well, because in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the United States, among others, thought that it would be a good idea for the Jews to have their own country, their own homeland. So the UN, at the urging of the United States, and of course, as we urged that, many people agreed with us, and so the State of Israel was created. So, established in 1948, the State of Israel is the homeland for the world's Jewish population. Now, Anwar Sadat, the president of Egypt, Menachem Begin, the prime minister of Israel, and this is in the late 70s. Now, they're instrumental, along with Jimmy Carter, in the Camp David Accords. Camp David is a presidential retreat a few miles outside of D.C. I believe it's in the mountains of Maryland. Easily accessible by helicopter, and by road as well. But again, the president can take off in Marine One. That's the helicopter he's flying in. And within, 20, 30 minutes, I think it is, be at Camp David. And it is a presidential retreat that has been used for 50 or 60 years by our presidents. All presidents use it as a place to go to get away for the weekend, to entertain foreign dignitaries, to entertain his staff as they're discussing domestic or foreign policy, to bring in advisors, members of Congress, those types of people for planning sessions for domestic foreign policy. This is the location where the Egyptians, the Israelis, and the Americans worked out what we call the Camp David Accords. Okay. Israel, under the Camp David Accords, agreed to return the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, which Israel had taken from Egypt in the Six-Day War in 1967. Keep in mind, Israel was created in 1948. The next year, they were attacked by several countries in the Middle East. Keep in mind, Israel is a Jewish country. The rest of the Middle East is Muslim. And the Muslim and Jews hate each other, and this goes back thousands of years. I mean, this is Old Testament stuff. So, in one of the numerous wars fought between Israel and their surrounding neighbors, in this case, Egypt, which we refer to as the Six-Day War, Israel had taken the Sinai Peninsula, which had belonged to Egypt, and at the Camp David Accords, the Israelis agreed to return it to Egypt. In exchange for the Sinai Peninsula, Egypt offered a peace treaty and the establishment of normal diplomatic relations with Israel. No other Arabic country, no other Muslim country on the planet had done this before. By doing this, keep in mind, excuse me, keep in mind that Egypt and the rest of the Muslim world had been at war with Israel since the day it was born. This ended about 30 years of warfare. And Anwar Sadat and Menachem Begin were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in the Camp David Accords. Now, many Arab leaders denounced, they didn't like the agreement that was reached by Sadat and Begin, which was essentially a peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. So much so, it was disliked by other Arabic Muslim leaders. Sadat being the president of Egypt, Sadat was assassinated by Muslim fundamentalists who disagreed with offering peace terms to the Jews. These Muslim fundamentalists, the great-grandfathers of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups today, they believe, they work toward the death of all Jews. So, because of Sadat's participation in this, he was murdered by those Muslims, and Sadat was a Muslim, who disagreed with it because they did not want peace with Israel. They wanted all Israelis dead. All right, let's move on to our next slide. And this will be our last slide that we will cover as I wait for my drawing board to end. Hold on. Okay, I'm back. I'm sorry. I had a problem with my drawing board, so I paused the video for a few moments so I can get it all set up and ready, and we're good to go now. So this will be our last slide for this presentation. SALT 2. We talked about SALT before, the Strategic Arms Limitation Talk under Nixon, which limited some of the nuclear weaponry, some of the weaponry of the Cold War. SALT 2 was an update of the previous SALT agreement. It was postponed due to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. Now, I got to keep in mind, nothing happens in a vacuum. We are negotiating with the Soviets, the Soviet Union, the Russians, for a new SALT agreement to expand the destruction of, the phasing out of certain nuclear weapons, other weapons as well. The Soviets invade Afghanistan in 1979, which was a huge, miserable war for them. If you don't believe me, go watch Rambo 3. And because of that, certain things happened. One of them, the SALT agreement, which had been entered into by Jimmy Carter. Of course, keep in mind, 79, Carter's still in office. The election in 1980, he loses his re-election bid to Ronald Reagan. We'll talk about that later. But he is still in office. and the agreement was postponed. Now, what else do we do? Well, in 1980, we have an Olympics year. The Olympics are being held in Moscow. The United States boycotts them. We do not go. In 1984, the Olympics are held in Los Angeles. The Russians and their allies do not go. So because of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, 2 Olympics, 80 and 84, are disrupted because of political reasons. Okay, let's get to our last 2 here. The Shah of Iran. The Shah, which is a word meaning leader, was an ally of the United States. He was not really a nice guy. Okay, hold on a second. I'm having some problems with my drawing board. And while my drawing board is straightening itself out, the Shah of Iran was not a nice guy. He had used quite brutal tactics and essentially was a dictator and created many enemies within his home country of Iran. Okay, so the Shah leader was a brutal dictator. Excuse me, brutal dictator, and had many enemies in Iran, including the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was one of the religious leaders of Iran. The Ayatollah essentially is, I imagine, like a cardinal, I would suppose. When he left Iran, when he fled Iran, it opened the door for Islamic fundamentalists like the Ayatollah Khomeini. It opened the door for these fundamentalists to seize power within Iran, leading to a theocracy. A theocracy is a government ruled by religion, by the religious leaders. So, Khomeini returns to Iran. He had been exiled from Iran for years, for decades, and spent a lot of his time in other countries like France. He organized the taking of the American embassy in Tehran, Tehran being the capital of Iran, and he held 52 Americans hostage for 444 days. So, the Shah is a supporter of the United States. We are a supporter of him. Even though he was somewhat brutal and a dictator, he was friendly to us. So again, we supported him. When he left Iran, fundamentalists, Islamic fundamentalists like Khomeini were allowed in, who had been exiled under the Shah's rule. They seized power, creating a theocracy, a Islamic theocracy. The Ayatollah Khomeini, who became really the best known of the religious leaders in Iran, organized the attack on the American embassy. 52 Americans were held hostage for 444 days. This spelled the end of the Carter administration. In the 1980 election, because many people perceived him to be weak because of, excuse me, because of what happened in Iran right here, because of what happened with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and we didn't do enough. The boycott of the 1980 Olympics, and keep in mind the Olympics are held in the same year as the presidential elections. Because of this, Carter was thought to be too weak, and he was replaced by Ronald Reagan. And we'll take that up with our next video. Okay, we're done.